sort of the underwriting theme here is about, I was talking about this with Jeffrey from Nelsonburg Wolves today when we were on Hudson Yards, is that there's incredible pressure on any process from the beginning of conceptual design all the way through implementation, kind of working against you, you know? This kind of constant evolving conditions of different forces kind of, it's going to, we'll see it as we go along, but the general premise is that a lack of vigilance is at any of those stages, sort of a lack of appreciation of the amount of sort of the depth and consideration that you have to maintain is really crucial, because the minute, it's like letting go of the tail of the tiger, right? The minute you let go, this kind of, these opposing forces work their way in, and I think we'll kind of see that as it evolves. So start here in Central Park, you know, our preeminent public landscape. It's pastoral, picturesque space, but it's also I mean, as much as it's a design space, and it is a highly designed space, it's also functioning as a successional woodland, right? There's a dynamic process underway there that isn't necessarily dictated by the original concept, is the way the plants perform over time. But one thing I'd like to think about when I'm there is that there's a bust dedicated to Humboldt on Central Park West, and he's an amazing guy for a lot of reasons. But he has this quote that I love. It says, "Nature is perfect until man deforms it with care." And I think that's kind of an underwriting theme of a lot of our public landscapes, right? And so we're not going to sort of pick on sort of individual choices, shall we say, but these are our kind of collective environments that we move through. And so, you know, homeowners should have what they like, but the person who built this home carved it out of this. Okay, and so none of the plants that are really interesting in that space made their way into that final scenario. So there are people, it's an architect's roof project here in the city, who are trying to kind of work in sort of more interesting species over time and try to develop something that they can then sort of test the performances. So what we find professionally a lot of times is sort of kind of pushing back against this desire to have landscape function as a garnish. I mean, I don't know what that little rectangle was meant to mean. If you live in this place in Long Island City, when you come home from work, are you comforted by that green arrival space? I'm not sure what it's meant to be, right? So at the end of the day, we're talking about sort of large public interventions and where are those opportunities. And so talking to Al about possibilities for this presentation, we started to focus on developing a public space, particularly in the realm of landscapes on structure, right, which have their own additional set of conditions. Here's a view from a client's project from very high floor, in the 80th floor here, looking west. And you can see, you know, obviously the Brooklyn Bridge Park project on piers is an example, roofs and bridges and all of that. So it's not just sort of this concept about what is possible to create, you know, sort of physically create this constructed space, you know, but what does that green layer look like, and what levels of sensitivity are required in order to get that to function. So here's a shot I've shown before. This is the ongoing hostage crisis. It's been going on in Boston for about 10 years in front of the convention center, because, you know, is there no evergreen that survives upright without burlap in the wintertime? Of course there is, right? But instead we insist on arborvitaes, and it doesn't work. They burn in between the little spirea muffins there. And so, you want to fix that, right? So you go back and then you just replace them with the exact same thing. So again, this is just an example of stuff, right? Just things that are thrown in. And so we're talking about really what the opportunities are along these lines. Is that the minute that you set a plant on the ground, before it even goes in, right? So this is actually just sitting waiting to be planted. It begins to engage its environment. And you can either do that positively, or it can do that in a way that's more disruptive. But in this case, Cephalanthus here is already got a pollinator working it. And so there are opportunities to kind of rebuild parts of our sort of living fabric to support these ecological services are really important in our community. And, you know, again, the market is working against us, right? We have candy-colored mulch, which finds its way into ground cover, which finds its way into the mulch volcano revolution, which has been continuing unabated for about 25 years, and into detention basins, okay? So what is the opportunity there? You have permeability, you have the ability to drain plants, but you have the ability to do it through plantings, right? The way that it was intended to, rain was intended to be managed in these kinds of places. So instead, you have this more abrupt, aggressive intervention. Here, my hometown here in Hartford, Connecticut, sadly, the detention basin's right. Some of the plants that are in the basin are fine. It's just that there's not enough of them, and obviously the mulch is not a necessary component there. So it doesn't have to be a big community in order to pilot these things. Here's Lancaster, Pennsylvania, kind of testing different combinations of plants. But the overall move toward permeability and sort of managing that with, managing stormwater with plants is where there's a tremendous amount of opportunity here. Years ago, when I was at Brooklyn Botanic Garden, we had a project with architects Weiss Manfredi and Hank White as architect, landscape architecture firm. And in addition to the green roof, which is obviously a big move on the new visitor center, we have these two large sort of basins, essentially, to manage stormwater from the parking lot that's shared with the Brooklyn Museum and populated with things like Amsonia and Panicum and Nyssa. But yet, even though this is the way of all things when it comes to the world of Bradford pears, right? This is a nursery last week. So that engine, that market engine, is still driving those choices that ultimately undermine so many of these projects, because this is sort of the kind of a hallmark of the commoditization of horticulture, that these are the things that are available, we go and get them, we put them in, and then we move on to the next thing. So we're talking about opportunities to be a little bit more aspirational. I find this example kind of fascinating, that there are aspects of the center island on West Street, on the west side of Manhattan, that didn't work, and yet when the median went into Flatbush Avenue, the exact same palette was flipped into the space, right? So there's no level of anticipation for what the result was going to be necessarily. And in that same median, we have to fight the urge to treat all ornamental grasses, right? That was sort of a term of art that has, I think, in a way, clouded sort of the nuance that exists between these grasses, and that ornamental grasses perform. So do you want a tall one or a short one or a yellow one or a red one? But in reality, the nuanced differences between warm season and cool season grasses, between plants that like moisture and plants that like dry, between plants that like fertile conditions and plants that abhor them, those become crucial. And I think even more importantly, plants that are invasive. So that I just reviewed some plants recently that had pennisetum on it, and it's just an unnecessary choice. I mean, that's a plant that's not just going to seed into your beds, it'll seed into your lawn. I mean, it is a really aggressive plant. So the pennisetums and the miscanthus, we have other opportunities, right? And so this sort of the grass component on the ground plane can be treated in different ways. On the left side, there is Sporobolus in there, there's Deschampsia in there. There's just not quite enough of it, but the plants are fine, and it sort of needs another layer. On the right-hand side is just a single note of Panicum in a planting in Arlington, Virginia. But that's got its vulnerable moment too. So as we start looking at what are the opportunities to add in layers of complexity that create a little bit more of an ability for the plantings to defend themselves seasonally. So I find one of the things that's interesting about planting design to me is that if you're an architect and you are designing a countertop, for example, and you're choosing the difference between marble or granite or wood or concrete or whatever, there's a delta between all of those, a price delta between all of those choices because of how fine the product is. But with planting, particularly herbaceous plants, if the plants are roughly about the same age and roughly about the same size, absent of a patent, they're the same cost, right? So you can make the exact perfect choice at the same time that you make the choice that's the unsuccessful one. So it really does convey the responsibility to the chooser to make sure that these projects get out to a great start. And having sort of been on the client end, it's a great responsibility because you can fight to get capital money and to build things, but it's almost impossible to get management money, right? To take care of things. It's really, really hard to do that. So if you've sort of set back an organization with choices that they need to fix, they're not necessarily going to have the resources, never mind the level of disruption that takes place once you go back in to do something a second time, right? And so the market has to cooperate as well. An example would be we had a specification package for a large project, and Oringium yucifolium on the left-hand side there was identified with a source, and when it showed up on the site, it was Oringium planum, which is not at all the same plant. And when we said, well, what's the story? And he says, well, they both begin with Oringium. And then you kind of explain that that's a problem, and they say, well, what's the difference? Well, I mean, you don't really have time if you're kind of waiting for a crane to load something in to explain the difference between these plants, but there is one, and so it's not a fussy choice that's been made. It's a cultural choice. It's a choice relative to the conditions, relative to the stature, relative to the texture, and so if you've really worked on those choices, it takes real resolve to fight through to get them to the end. You're not trying to canonize your original ideas, right? But you did vet it. And so if the market pressure at the last minute is, hurry up, we got to get our C of O, and the wrong thing is there and somebody's pushing you to put it in, it's really hard to push back and get them to do it right, but it's important, right? And so when we're looking at some of these choices, like culturally, what is appropriate. If you have a condition like on the right-hand side, if your New York asters are gathering mildew in your landscape, and you use the aromatic aster on the left-hand side, you can bypass all of that and end up with this really robust, vigorous, nearly bulletproof plant. Here it is again. This is Radon's favorite, but Nancy showed October Skies. Both are great. Species is great. And that is a durable, long-lived option for you. And so we start to carve into both environments, right, and then sort of dynamic cycles to start to look for candidates for inclusion into these landscapes on structure. This is in western New Jersey. It's largely an Indian grass-dominated meadow, and the difference between the lawn and the meadow is the mower, right? And the difference between the meadow and the woodland is the annual mowing plus time. So if you dig into that meadow, you'll find all of the woody pioneers that take place in the successional process, and in time, a version of the woody system would find its way back. Like in its DNA, that space knows that it was once woodland, and it's constantly working its way back. So if you think about the processes of editing, managing these dynamic landscapes through sort of editing, you are essentially trapping the landscape in a certain, if you're at a lawn, you're sort of trapping it in that stage of succession. If you're in a meadow, you're trapping it in that stage of succession. But you're also paying mind to what's in it. So I had a project where we had a specific meadow mix and seeds sourced, and without knowing, the contractor had swapped to a different mix, and we ended up with Indian grass. So if you end up with Indian grass, you have a really super aggressive grass where other things become more challenging. You end up with a sort of a tall meadow than you might have otherwise wanted, and so the balancing of those individual choices against what your ultimate goals are really crucial. And the other thing is, many of our landscapes are overly fertile. So some things like Schizocerium, or little blue stem, or Ergrostis, will function a little bit more, have a little bit more challenge in a loamy, sort of heavier, rich soil. So we're not looking to give the plant what it wants on its best day. Really, we're trying to see what are its tolerances, and so how far can we push these things? And so where are these austere climates? Where do they exist? Coastal plain is a really great example. This is the Far Barn at the Poly Hill Arboretum on Martha's Vineyard. And I was doing a talk there once and was talking about this meadow and how much I love the plants that were in it. And people were like, well, it's kind of just weeds. We burn that. We're not really interested in it. And I said, well, I'm particularly interested in that lime green plant, you know, that was growing in among the grasses and forbs that were there. And so in October, I got back. Well, first of all, in that same month, in October, if you dug around, there was, you know, these plants, Liatris scariosa novangli on the right-hand side, Pycnanthemum tenuifolium in the middle, and Asclepias tuberosa on the left. Those were in there, so that's pretty good for August. You know, it's a tough month otherwise, right? But in the fall, I went back for that because that's Rus copalinum variety latifolium, kind of a lower growing, and particularly in the sand where there's not a lot of fertility, a low growing woody plant that is functionally bulletproof and really beautiful in that with the little blue stem there. And you can see in the sand, little blue stem sitting up nice and starchy. So there are other examples of these conditions. You know, there's dry sloped woods where Viburnum acerifolium starts that way and gets that way in the fall. Although this fall, when it was a little warmer, it was sort of like a little ghostly. One hillside in Connecticut, a really dry rock cliff, Rhododendron paraclimenoides. These are just different genotypes that had seeded in, different flowers. Not one, but two state cops pulled over to ask me what I was doing that day on the side of the road, which I thought was interesting. If you're trespassing or doing that kind of botanizing, tell them you're looking at plants, they get confused and they drive away. They said nothing, they just drove away. I had one client in the Hudson Valley who wanted to do a project. He wanted to clear out the woods. He said the woods were too dense and they were dirty, and he wanted to clean them. And so he had to go through this process of saying, you know, all those little plants, there's Astraea in there, there's Carpinus in there, there's that rhododendron again, there's Aquilegia. And so it sort of repaired his relationship with this old carriage road to find out that there was more happening and that maybe a more careful editing could yield some results that were sufficiently, at least for him, sufficiently ornamental. So a lot of it's not native, exotic, really. It's more like kind of finding a balance. You know, what works in this particular area. For one client in Maine, we had Acer pennsylvanicum on the property, and we found some seedlings, and we moved them in, and then she was really interested in the foliage types, the bigger foliage, and so we ended up with Aesculus parviflora and Rubus odoratus there on the bottom, and we had all these ferns, and then naturally these hawkweeds were in there, right? So hawkweed's not native, but it's beautiful, and it's not aggressive. It exists, it hangs out, it's orange or it's yellow, it's fine, right? So we work around that and kind of move on to the next thing. More examples of things from austere landscapes. A lot of them come from wetlands, you know, wetlands that are wet and can take inundation, but they also become dry during dry seasons and then become some of our most drought-tolerant plants. And in the same planting, that alder and that winterberry holly side by side, where in this case too, the alder through the nitrogen fixing process is providing sort of fertility or sort of providing resources to its surrounding species like that ilex. Or digging into even coastal marshes for projects. So there's big prominent urban projects. We did 2 semesters at the GSE on just people, new students kind of working in coastal design using Spartina, for example, which was interesting. So they got to kind of dig around in these plains and to think of them not just functionally, but find this sort of this aesthetic mood that could be compelling in some way, and then also solve civic problems as we start to look at projects associated with resiliency efforts in our coastal areas. One client on the Connecticut shore lives in a kind of a little peninsula community. At the end of this, there's a little causeway that kind of leads there. And on the edge of the salt marsh is this one little sandy slope. It's about 10 feet wide and about 3 feet at the top off of the salt line. And just digging in August, there's New York ironweed, there's hibiscus there, the rose mallow, and lots of other stuff. Just last week, Ilex verticillata, Rosa virginiana. There's the kind of the dried out wands of Vernonia. There's eutrochium in there. There's a lot of really cool stuff in there, and that's all pretty ornamental. The gateway to the side community that you pass on the way, that's the entrance right across from that planting. White marble chips with roses and nothing, right? So people aren't necessarily always going to agree on aesthetics, but I think you can start to agree on performance in landscape function and whether one is and whether one isn't, and I'm pretty safe to say that that one is not. In another coastal plain community, Solidago odora here, you see the, again, little blue stem, starchy green, starchy purple there. The green, again, is the roost. And then if you pan a little bit to the right, 50 yards to the right, Euthymia graminifolia, which Nancy had a picture of, and which is formerly a goldenrod, and then, or Solidago. And then the little lime green is the roost again, and the little ground cover plant is Arctostaphylos ursi. And in the fall, you know, the seed heads turn white, which gives you sort of another flowering thing, and then the little blue stem colors up. So it's great to observe these things, right, and to want to do something about it, but you need help. So this is Pierre Benaroup, and anybody know Pierre? So Pierre is a nursery legend, particularly in the herbaceous world, the Sunny Border Nursery in Connecticut. And this is at Sunny Border, and we're looking at plants. And I was actually there for this Pycnianthemum tenuifolium, not for the sort of the candy-colored Olympics of echinacea trials there in the background and heuchera, you know, in between. And so it's not a knock on anybody if they want those plants. They just, one, to me, should perform like perennials, which not all of them do, and the other should be that they function in a sort of in a relationship to the plants that are around. So they're not just some novelty that we're pursuing. And so this is a plant that is really useful for us. But in order for Pierre to grow it effectively, somebody has to buy it. Because otherwise, it's just the thing that sits in the back that somebody asked him to grow that they never bought. And so I would buy things from him that he wasn't selling as much of, right? So Echinacea pallida, which is a real perennial echinacea, would be one example. Salvia azureus is another example, or native Midwestern salvia. And there are woody examples of this kind of nursery person. This is Summerhill Nursery in Connecticut. And it's just the owner's collections of, he would provenance collect mountain laurel from all different parts of New England and give them sort of relative names that people could kind of track and then kind of grow something that was more interesting. So if your nursery person knows plant provenance, that is another sort of clue to, or potential clue at least, to being able to use it successfully. So these plants end up in a couple of different places that are kind of unique in the sense that they are fully constructed and in an otherwise pretty violent condition. This is at Pier 4 in Boston with Reed Hildebrand, where there's this large sort of V-shaped drainage cut right on Boston Harbor, which is functionally saline. It's like 98% salt. And so we started to think about what were the plants that could live in that sort of low zone and tolerate that in the more upland conditions, and that the circles on the drawing not just be circles, that scale means something, right? Because scale is such an enormous challenge in planting design. And so I started to look at these, not just sort of examples of storm surges, but what is the anticipatory performance of that tide. And in Massachusetts, they have sort of low tide, mid tide, high tide, and they actually have a designation for wicked high tide. So if you're from New England, it's a real term. And so we had some wicked high tides here. This is the Pier 4 kind of looking back to the city, to the south end, and the Institute of Contemporary Art there, and then the walkway along. So this will be part of that same circulation system, but there's a little camera that keeps us apprised of when the planters fill up with harbor water. And to start to really anticipate what are the examples in all those previously challenging landscapes where we can kind of make that space more resilient than when it might be otherwise. But the process of planting design is still an aesthetic one, and I think it's nice to have ecological terms and really in a functional way matter. But I think in a lot of times they get misappropriated, and what people are doing essentially is decorating and creating things that they think are aesthetically appealing with plants that they like, right? Which is fine, but I think the point is that it has to work, right? So we start noodling around this way, and we're doing conceptual stuff. This was for the Air and Space Museum, so we're thinking about plants and how they might connect to flight. And so there are these narrative points that are important because people need a story sometimes to kind of latch onto. We start to do these sort of exercises in space and scale so that you can see where the repetition is. And then you start to get into sort of depth of intensity, right? How diverse are those plantings going to be? And so in this case, this is a simple plane of Helianthus coming up through Amsonia hubrichtii. This is basically just the dogbane family, Apocinaceae here. You have Opossum and four different taxa of Amsonia and one little sort of herbaceous ground plane planting, which is pretty awesome in the fall as well. But so you have a choice between these highly diverse plantings, like the one on the left, and sort of these sort of simpler mixes. And there are levels of aesthetic tolerances that clients are going to have for this. So as one example, the client for the Highline is not the client for the Hudson Yards, right? They want to have a dynamic landscape, but aesthetically, those are not the same idea. So the idea is like how complex can you make it and still achieve a connection with your clients or your end users that is a real bond. And the argument for a more complex design is that it's more resilient, right? That if you pull out any one of those threads, there's Butaloa in there, there's Echinacea, there's Rotibida, Amsonia, Panicum, Spiralis righti in the upper right corner. You pull out, a couple things here or there, and you haven't lost the sort of dynamic character. And you've also ended up with something that's a little bit more seasonally forgiving, as opposed to the sort of monotypic ground plane that, when it has a weak moment, really drops down. And we'll see an example of that. And so this is done. This is Brooklyn folks. I know that in the front yard, small little townhome gardens, and on large public spaces as well. In some cases, it's about building a client's relationship with a certain type of plant. So in this case, for this particular client in Maine, the sort of the gateway drug for becoming more engaged was Gillenia, Bowman's root. And she loves this plant now. She takes cuttings of it and brings it inside. And so that kind of spurred on this, what else can we do? What else is like that? What are the other opportunities? And so there is a progression that moves from that. I know you've all seen examples from Pete Odolph's great work out here at the Lurie Garden. I was there a couple of times this year. It's kind of unusual for one summer to be there a few times, but at different seasons. And so the Amsonia is great, and you see the prairie smoke there. There's prairie smoke doing its thing. GM, triflorum. And there's, what he would call the Salvia River, which is really beautiful, right? Well, you're hanging that's a big peg, right, that you're hanging things on, because when that goes down, then you need this sort of subsequent layer to come in and push. And when it's done out of scale, there's another example in New York here, down the Battery, then you have that grass layer is still there, but now in the sort of the rough, after the rough season, the salvia layer is not quite as representative in its space. So how do you develop resilience in that? The advantage of plants like this, in the case of Amsonia and Baptisia, right behind it, is those are two very, very long-lived perennials, right? Very, very tough. And so they're going to hold their own, particularly in our climate, plants that hold their own against warm season grasses. And that you have this subsequent move where you can, you get another season or another sort of mood available from the same mass plantings. But the nice thing about this kind of a dynamic landscape that Pete did is that you can see it, you can engage it as you do on the left as this panoramic, really amazing, mind-blowing urban view. Or you could be the person on that path and have the intimate experience of like looking down and seeing that gentian, and then like having that kind of connect you to another idea and say, well, let me pursue that thread and see what I might be able to do with that plant. And so particularly through that Chicago process, as Pete was engaged with Roy Diblick and started to become aware of these remnant prairie communities, sort of this dynamic complexity sort of rose its head again, and he started to think about, well, what are the opportunities there? So even in this sort of late fall moment, you can see the senescent foliage of Parthenium and Silphium terebinthinaceum as an example. But if you put a 10-meter square there, you could find 25 plants that people are gawking at the High Line. They're just all blended together, and that at the end of a housing tract, just a little bit of prairie that's kind of held its own from development. And so they have to find their way out of there, though, right, in order for you to use them. Those plants are still hard to source here, particularly in the east. And so you go to a place like Chicago Botanic Garden, which is starting to not just trial plants like on the left-hand side. That's one of Brent Horvath's selections of Amsonia, Tabernet Montana Fontana, which has those kind of purple stems and the darker flower. And then there are roof trials on their science building where they're looking at different species and how they perform in sort of shallow, more challenging soil conditions. So Al said talk about the High Line. So I'm going to talk about the High Line for Al. Committee request. So this is the way I first came to the High Line as a trespasser. Because I heard what was going on, and then it was condemned. Okay, it was condemned, and so we thought that, might not be around for long. And so it was interesting to watch that process unfold, where they're going to sort of lightly lay a shallow tray essentially onto the existing bridge, where not all, but most of the soil media is 18 inches deep. And then to know it before was to know it wasn't perfect, but there are multiple seasons of everything. So if we go from, this condition in early spring, that same space above 30th Street did that in the fall. So there was a sort of codominant meadow of Eupatorium and Schizocurium, and again, growing in ballast with little bits of sort of rudimentary soil from a series of seasons, right? And so we took Roy and Pete up there and started to look around, and it became sort of inspired by this condition. But everything had to come off. It became responsible for a bridge that needed expansion joints and couldn't leak. And so everything came off, and a screed layer was put in, and then these essentially like children's building blocks. The planks went in, and then into the voids. Whoops, sorry. Just jumped ahead there. So into the voids went soil, and part of the, at the time when we started working with Friends of the High Line in the Parks Department, I was still at Brooklyn Botanic Garden and asked to advise on some plant selection choices. And so there were two kind of themes for those choices, like what would function in this kind of a landscape, or what could function in this kind of landscape, and then what's the best way to acclimate it? And kind of pushing for back against this sort of desire to have it looked finished on the first day, and starting with smaller varieties of things. And so the original premise, at least in the conceptual premise in that first design meeting, was, and it's important to know too, that the High Line was led by a landscape architect, right, not by an architect. So there's James Corner Field Operations in partnership with Pete Odolph as planting designer and Joe Scafidio-Renfro as architects. And so where there are those core 10 boxes, you just add that measure of volume to 18 inches and you get a sort of a deeper condition. But the original premise was they wanted to use river birch, which I thought was way too big and way too competitive for what they wanted to do around it. And thought about kid growing up in New England, where we'd go through these rock outcrops where the gray birch were growing in cracks, and say, well, what if we looked at Betula populifolia? So that's what we ended up with here, and with a ground plane underneath, a mix of sedges, grasses, and other blooming plants, some bulbs, Carex laxicolmus there. There's that same aromatic aster again, and then a winter condition as well. So as time kind of has evolved, you have this, this condition now. You see the Whitney is almost done in this picture, and you have late summer going into fall, going into winter, and then this condition, which would not be a winter landscape for a lot of people unless you ever went outside during the winter, right? Because this is a winter landscape that people should be familiar with. And so we have this space that people then can engage with. So these kids walking through the tracks are going to remember this as a much larger experience. But one thing that is more revealed now than it used to be, that always known that's tucked in there, and I borrowed this picture from Deborah Munson, is you see that little yellow on the far left side, how all the birches are kind of gold and there's one yellow larger mushroom? That's actually a ASLA-NY that was planted by accident during the construction. You see it there? So you get a sense of the sort of the dynamic difference between those two things. So when somebody says to you, what does it matter? That's why it does, right? So we have really shallow soils. Unfortunately, that building on the left has given way to the Carpenter glass box, but now it looks like that, right? And so all of these sort of things are performing pretty quickly. So I'll show you a time lapse of how you, if your plants are right, your soil's right, and you get them watered to establish how you can achieve the herbaceous stuff pretty quickly. So averaging about 1.5 centers, some wider for the plants here and there. Here in Chelsea, the Chelsea area, so above 18th Street. This is fall of 2008, the following spring 2009, spring 2009. So now we're into June, July, August into September, and a year later, okay? Now, the intentions are to have all of these plants function as their kind of interrelated character, but the reality is that having that much selenium is a real challenge in this space, and so that experience doesn't exist anymore. So it didn't really exist after the first year. So there's this process that unfolds where you're starting to determine what's going to work and what isn't. But the important thing to know is that all of that dynamism, again, is coming out of 18 inches. So if you keep your eye on, there's Sporobolus there, there's Dahlia there, there's Monarda. If you keep your eye on the Monarda, there's the same space 2 years later in that same shallow space, right? And then, the gardens should belong to the people that care for them, right? So people should, evolve them and find out what works. We peeled back on Rudbeckia tomentosa. We said to Pete, you don't really like yellow. Why is there so much yellow here? He goes, you're right, we'll just take it out. So a lot of it came out, and Veronicastrum came in, so that the dialogue with the designer, I know still to this day, Pete and the gardeners are engaged in that discussion. And then there are some things in that same space that are bananas. There's Quercus muhlenbergii, Quercus macrocarpa there. There's a big oak, right, growing in the half meter, and it's doing its thing. So there's the oak again. So this is a dynamic character. We hope that it gets to the neighbors. It hasn't. There's the house on 20th Street. There are the 30-foot honey locusts that went in onto that roof as a new neighbor there. But this sort of editing process is part of the deal. As we move forward, we have a scenario here where at the sun deck at 14th Street, we mixed up taxa. So mixing up taxa of a certain genus can give you a sort of a more dynamic character. In this case, there's a bunch of different taxa of Rus. There's Rus glabra, Typhina, Typhina laciniata. There's the interspecific ones, the glabra, Rus ex pulverulenta. In this case, the Hillier form, which is super red in the fall. But it gives you sort of a kind of a relay race staggered effect to fall. And then people then begin to lounge under things they formerly considered obnoxious roadside weeds, right? Which now, in a new context, is a more romantic experience. And so this immersive thing where you have an immersive landscape city experience that has catalyzed all of this boom, and now there's the Bjarke Ingels Tower is already up for this picture. And you have 3 Pritzker Prize winners there on the corner of 19th and West as a sort of a offshoot of a landscape experience, which is pretty wild. So we go to the flyover. We've got just a couple of minutes left. So we go into the flyover. So originally the idea was to have Rus copulina, which was not quite tall enough to be a canopy experience. So he started to explore this kind of combination of this Magnolia virginiana with some of the North American big leaf magnolias like Macrophylla variety Ashai, Tripetala, and I took pictures on the way down from the arts this morning because there was a woman who's picking up leaves that had fallen and waving them around her head happily. And so it's great to see people sort of engage in physical ways and enthusiastic ways with these plants, which are unusual and not something we necessarily get to engage with in the urban environment. The other important thing here was scale. So we started with for cultural reasons, when it started with plants that we could actually grow, get to survive, and had to explain that, that macrophylla, for example, will grow 3 feet in a year, but you have to sort of prove that, right? And so same thing with the sassafras, which is doesn't transplant well from a dug B&B condition. So getting them to use little car antenna whips that we found here, sassafras, yielded us a second bonus, which was the seedling diversity of that fall color. This is just one fall with all of the range of sassafras color. And then this bonus, which started last year, which is because we have dioecious species here, that we have enough pollination to create fruit. And this is an all too rare a view in nature, because those are so appealing to birds that they don't always hang on long enough for us to enjoy them. But it was great to see them on the bridge. And so what was this has become this, right? So because these things have really grown and started to establish themselves. So as we go up to the yards, that's a more complex thing. If you find me on Instagram, I'll put up some pictures later, because we just took them this morning, of finding an opportunity to kind of work another layer onto another complex platform, which required this incredibly involved process of cooling soils to be able to, which would have been heated up by the compressors of the air conditioners of the idling Long Island Railroad trains. But this enormous city that's sort of developing, which is a Nelson Bird Woltz project, which is, a really, really dramatic space. I think you'll see for scale once you're involved. So it's still just being planted now. But what it's afforded, I think all of these projects afford are for people in general, but kids, I think particularly, to engage with the city from a different perspective, and to get sort of excited about opportunities, and then to also get the second benefit of this ecological services, pollinators, habitats. These are all organisms that we found on the Highline just in 1 year. So you want to? I can leave it there, Al. You want to do that? Okay. I'll stick around for questions later if anybody has them. Thank you.